There's a moment in the Bible that you've probably read dozens of times, an episode that seems simple, even naive. A wedding feast in a small village in Galilee, wine that runs out, a miracle that transforms water into wine. A familiar story, right? But what if I told you that this account hides one of the most disturbing truths of Christianity? What if the wedding at Cana isn't just about a miracle, but about a revelation that the church needed to silence for 2,000 years? What you're about to discover isn't fantasy. It's not empty conspiracy theory. It's the result of textual analysis, academic studies, and traditions preserved in silence by communities that refuse to forget. It's about a detail that's right there, in plain sight, hidden from everyone. Think about it. Why would this be Jesus' first miracle? Why specifically at a wedding? And why did Mary, his mother, have so much authority over the servants of a house that theoretically wasn't hers? For centuries, these questions were deflected, ignored, buried under layers of safe interpretations. But today you're going to look at the wedding at Cana with completely new eyes. And when you finish this video, you'll never read John chapter 2 the same way again. Because the truth is that this wedding in Cana wasn't just any event. Ancient traditions suggest something that ecclesiastical councils preferred to erase. Manuscripts that were left out of the official Bible point to a different reality. And even the canonical text, when analyzed carefully, reveals cracks in the official narrative. Have you ever stopped to wonder why the identity of the groom is never revealed? Throughout all the Gospels, names are mentioned: Zacchaeus, Jairus, Nicodemus, Lazarus. But at the wedding at Cana, the protagonist of the event, the groom, is a nameless ghost. Why? And Mary. Mary. She doesn't just suggest that Jesus do something. She orders the servants, do whatever he tells you. What kind of guest gives orders to the servants at a party? What authority is this? Anthropological studies of first-century Jewish weddings reveal fascinating details. In that culture, only the groom's immediate family had power over the servants. Only the groom's mother could intervene in this way during a crisis involving the feast. And there was a crisis. The wine had run out. For us today, it might seem like just a social embarrassment. But back then, it was a devastating humiliation. It was a public failure that would stain the family's reputation for generations. The groom was responsible for providing enough wine. And when Mary notices the problem, she acts immediately, not as a guest, as someone who had direct responsibility over that event. Now let these pieces of information settle for a moment. A wedding, a nameless groom, Mary with the authority of a hostess, Jesus performing his first public miracle right there. What really happened at the wedding at Cana? This question has troubled theologians for centuries. Some simply avoided the subject. Others created explanations that don't withstand deeper cultural and historical analysis. And a small but courageous portion of scholars began investigating traditions that survived outside the walls of orthodoxy. And what these traditions say will shake your certainties. Because if what you've believed your whole life about this episode is wrong, what else might be wrong? If the early church decided to shape this narrative in a specific way, hiding uncomfortable details, what other truths were adjusted to serve an institutional agenda? You don't need to abandon your faith to ask these questions. In fact, asking is an act of faith. It's trusting that truth is stronger than dogma. It's believing that God doesn't fear your sincere search for knowledge. So prepare yourself, because in the next few minutes we're going to dismantle one of Christianity's most protected narratives. We're going to examine the biblical text with a magnifying glass. We're going to bring to light traditions that were silenced, and we're going to give you tools so you can draw your own conclusions. Because the truth about the wedding at Cana isn't lost. It's always been there, waiting for someone to have the courage to look. Let's start with the basics. What does the Bible really say about the wedding at Cana? The account is in John 2:1-11, and it's important to read carefully, word by word, because details matter. The text begins like this: 3 days later there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and Jesus' mother was there. Jesus and his disciples were also invited to the wedding. First observation: Mary wasn't invited. She was there. The grammatical construction in the original Greek suggests she was already present, as if she were part of the organization. Jesus and the disciples, they were the ones who were invited. Subtle, but significant. The text continues. When the wine ran out, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." Jesus answered, "Woman, why do you involve me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Here we have several layers of strangeness. First, why does Mary worry about the wine? If she were just a guest, it wouldn't be her responsibility to solve this problem. The most natural thing would be for her to feel embarrassed along with the other guests, but not to take the initiative to seek a solution. Second, Jesus' response. He uses the word woman, which in Greek is ginai, a respectful but distant term. It's not mother. It's as if he's establishing a boundary. Why do you involve me? Literally in Greek, what is there between me and you? This phrase is used in other places in the Bible to mark a separation of responsibilities. Jesus is essentially saying, "This isn't my responsibility, it's not my problem." But if it wasn't his problem, whose was it? The groom's. Always the groom's. And yet, Mary ignores Jesus' response and goes straight to the servants. Do whatever he tells you. As if she knew that despite the initial resistance, Jesus would end up solving it. As if this were somehow a shared responsibility between them. The miracle happens. 6 stone water jars used for Jewish ritual purification are filled with water, between 80 and 120 liters each. In total, somewhere between 480 and 720 liters of water, which are transformed into wine. And it's not just any wine. The master of the banquet, upon tasting it, calls the groom and says, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and after the guests have had plenty to drink, then the inferior wine. But you have saved the best wine until now." He speaks to the groom. But it was Jesus who provided the wine. Interesting, isn't it? And the groom? Absolute silence. He doesn't respond. He doesn't give thanks. He simply disappears from the narrative, as if he were a secondary character at his own wedding feast. John concludes, "This was the first of the signs Jesus performed. It happened in Cana of Galilee, and thus he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him." First sign. First public demonstration of power. And it happens at a wedding where the groom has no name, Jesus' mother acts as hostess, and Jesus solves a problem that wasn't his. Now let's look at the gaps. Bible scholars note that the Gospel of John is extremely detail-oriented. He mentions names, specific places, even times of day. It was about the 6th hour. It was almost the 6th hour. John doesn't spare precision, but here, in this event so significant, the first miracle, he omits the groom's name. And the bride's too. In fact, the bride isn't even mentioned once in the entire text. It's as if the wedding were just a backdrop, not the main event. Why? Some traditional interpretations say John omitted the names to protect the privacy of those involved. But that doesn't make sense. John mentions Lazarus by name and then describes his resurrection, an event that would certainly attract unwanted attention. He mentions Mary Magdalene, Martha, Nicodemus, Joseph of Arimathea. Why protect specifically the groom of Cana? Other interpretations suggest the names weren't important to the spiritual message of the miracle, but John usually gives context. When Jesus heals the man born blind, John mentions he was sitting begging for alms. When he heals the paralytic, he describes that he had been there for 38 years. Details matter to John, except apparently when it comes to the wedding at Cana. The truth is that this omission generated centuries of speculation. And some of these speculations came from unexpected places. Oral traditions preserved in early Christian communities, apocryphal texts that didn't enter the official canon, and even linguistic analyses of the Greek text that reveal nuances lost in modern translations. What all these sources suggest goes against everything you learned in Sunday school, and that's exactly why we need to continue investigating. If you're feeling that restlessness growing inside you, that feeling that you're finally asking the right questions, then you need to subscribe to this channel now. Why? Because what we're going to explore in the next few minutes is just the tip of the iceberg. There are dozens of biblical narratives that hide similar truths, layers of meaning that were softened, adjusted, or completely reinterpreted over the centuries. And here in this space, we commit to investigating these truths with seriousness, respect, and intellectual courage. So subscribe now, because this journey is just beginning, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Let's delve deeper into Mary's behavior at the wedding at Cana, because the more you examine it, the stranger it gets. Imagine the scene. a wedding feast in 1st century Galilee. Jewish weddings of that era were massive community events. They didn't last a few hours, they lasted days, sometimes an entire week. The groom's family was responsible for feeding and entertaining dozens, sometimes hundreds of guests throughout this entire period. It was a public demonstration of prosperity and generosity, and failing in this demonstration was a shame that would mark the family for generations. Anthropological studies of ancient Mediterranean culture show that honor and shame were the pillars of social structure. Your reputation was everything, so when the wine runs out in the middle of the feast, it's not just a logistical problem, it's a social catastrophe. And who notices first? Mary. Not the servants, who should have been monitoring supplies. Not the master of the banquet, responsible for coordinating the service. Mary. And she doesn't just notice, she acts immediately to solve it. This tells us something fundamental. Mary was paying attention to the operational details of the feast. She was monitoring, like someone who had direct responsibility over the event. Research on Jewish family structure in the Second Temple period indicates that mothers had a central role in organizing weddings, especially the weddings of their own children. The groom's mother was essentially the event coordinator. She supervised the food, the drink, the comfort of the guests. Exactly what Mary is doing in Cana. But there's more. When Mary identifies the problem, she doesn't go talk to the master of the banquet. She doesn't look for the groom. She goes straight to Jesus, as if he were the natural person to solve that crisis, as if he somehow had responsibility over the success of that event. And Jesus' response is revealing. "Woman, why do you involve me? My hour has not yet come." Let's pause here. "My hour has not yet come" is a phrase John uses several times in his gospel, always referring to the moment of Jesus' crucifixion and glorification. It's a technical, theological term. Jesus is saying, it's not time to reveal who I really am. But why would he associate making wine at a party with revealing his messianic identity? Why would this be so significant? Unless it wasn't just a party, unless that specific moment, that specific place, had a deep, personal significance for Jesus, something that would make a miracle there particularly revealing. Mary, however, insists, and this is crucial. She doesn't accept the refusal. She goes to the servants and says, "Do whatever he tells you." What authority did Mary have to give orders to the servants? Analyses of domestic hierarchy in 1st century Galilean houses show that servants obeyed a clear chain of command. First the master of the house, then the master's wife, then adult children. Guests didn't give orders to servants, never, unless they weren't just guests. And the servants obey immediately, without questioning, as if they were accustomed to receiving instructions from Mary, as if she were a recognized authority figure in that house. There's yet another fascinating detail. The text says, Mary was there before Jesus arrived. In the original Greek, the construction suggests she was already present, possibly involved in the preparations. Jesus and the disciples arrived later as guests. Why would Mary arrive first? Why would she be there from the beginning? Traditions preserved in some patristic texts, writings of the early church fathers, mention that Mary had a close relationship with the family of Cana. Some of these traditions suggest family ties, others insinuate something different. But the most interesting thing is the institutional silence about these traditions. Many patristic texts were preserved, copied, and intensively studied. But those that speculated about the exact nature of Mary's involvement in Cana were curiously less copied, less studied, as if there were discomfort in exploring this theme too deeply. What did they know that we don't know? There's an interesting parallel at another moment in Jesus' ministry. At the wedding of Cana, Mary takes initiative and Jesus resists initially, but then acts. At the crucifixion, Mary is at the foot of the cross, and Jesus, from the top of the cross, says to her, "Woman, here is your son," referring to John. And to John, "Here is your mother." Again, woman, not mother. A respectful but deliberate distancing. Scholars note that John, in writing his gospel, creates intentional connections between the beginning and end of Jesus' ministry. The first sign in Cana and the last sign on the cross are theologically linked. In both, Mary is present. In both, Jesus calls her woman. In both, there's wine. In Cana, wine of celebration; on the cross, bitter wine offered to Jesus. It's as if John was saying, if you understand Cana, you'll understand the cross, and vice versa. But what exactly did he want us to understand? The key may be in what John doesn't say, in the deliberate omissions, in the nameless groom, in the bride who never appears, in Mary acting as hostess without being presented as such, in Jesus performing his first public miracle in a curiously intimate and domestic context. All these pieces form a puzzle, and when you start putting it together, the image that emerges is disturbing, especially if you were taught your whole life that Jesus was celibate, that his mission was purely spiritual, that romantic or family relationships were out of the question. But what if that's not the whole story? What if the wedding at Cana is actually a carefully coded record of something the early Christians knew, but later generations decided to erase? Now let's dive into the Greek, because the Bible you read in English went through multiple layers of translation, and in each layer choices were made, words were softened, nuances were lost. The New Testament was originally written in Koine Greek, the common Greek spoken in the 1st century Roman Empire. And when we examine the Greek text of John 2:1-11, we find fascinating details that simply don't survive translation. Let's start with the first sentence. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee. In English, it seems like a simple temporal marker. 3 days after something. But after what? John just finished narrating the calling of the first disciples. 3 days after that, there's a wedding. But in Greek, on the third day has much deeper resonances. It's a phrase loaded with theological meaning. The third day is when Jesus rose from the dead. It's a symbolic number of completeness and divine revelation. John uses this phrase intentionally, signaling to readers, pay attention, something important is about to happen. Then we have the description of Mary being there. In Greek, it's enimitir tui sueki, was the mother of Jesus there. The verb tense indicates a continuous state. She didn't arrive, she was already present, which reinforces our earlier analysis. Mary wasn't invited like the others. She was part of the event's structure. Now the crucial part. When Mary tells Jesus they have no more wine, the Greek phrase is unon uk echusin, wine not they have. It's a simple statement, factual, but the tone implies expectation. It's not, there's a problem here. It's, we have a problem here that needs to be solved. The we is implicit in the structure of the phrase, and Jesus' response, ti emike si gine, word by word, what to me and to you, woman? This phrase, ti emoi kai soi, is a Hebrew idiomatic expression transliterated into Greek. It appears several times in the Old Testament, and it always marks a separation of responsibilities or spheres of influence. It's used when someone wants to say, this doesn't concern me, or don't get in my way. But here's the interesting detail. When this phrase is used between close family members, it often indicates not an absolute distancing, but a negotiation of roles. It's as if Jesus was saying, you're putting me in a difficult position. You know what you're asking. And Mary responds not to Jesus, but to the servants, as if the negotiation had been resolved, as if she knew that despite the resistance, Jesus would do what was necessary, because in the end, it was necessary for the family, for honor, to avoid public shame. Now let's go to the word gine, woman. In modern translations, this sounds harsh, distant, but in Koine Greek, gyne was actually a term of respect. It wasn't offensive. Jesus uses the same word when speaking to Mary from the top of the cross, and when speaking to other women throughout the Gospels, always with respect. But it was also a formal term, not intimate, not mother, mitre, not mommy. It was a way of establishing professional distance, even within a family relationship. Why would Jesus need to establish this distance? Literary analyses suggest that John is creating a theological separation. The Jesus of faith, the Messiah, the Son of God, is in tension with the historical Jesus, the Son of Mary, member of a human family. And Cana is the moment when these two identities begin to collide, because performing that miracle meant exposing himself. It meant beginning to reveal who he really was. And in such a specific environment, a wedding in a small village surrounded by family and friends, this revelation would have immediate personal consequences. Jesus was essentially saying, if I do this, my private life ends. Do you understand what you're asking? And Mary, yes, but it's necessary. Then we have the description of the wine, The master of the banquet tastes it and says to the groom, "You have saved the best wine until now." In Greek, "Sytetirikas ton kalon inon ios arti," you have kept the good wine until now. The verb tereo means to keep, to preserve, to keep safe. It's not just you refrained from serving, it's you intentionally kept. It implies planning, deliberate care. The master of the banquet is praising the groom for an intelligent strategy, serving the inferior wine first, when guests are less discerning, and then bringing out the best. But who really planned this? Jesus. Through the miracle, and the groom doesn't respond, doesn't correct the master of the banquet by saying, "Actually, it wasn't me." Simply silence. Why? Because accepting credit for the miracle would be natural? Because the miracle was somehow directly benefiting him? Scholars of the Johannine narrative note that John frequently uses dramatic irony, situations where the characters say one thing, but the reader knows something more. The master of the banquet praises the groom without knowing that the true provider of the wine is there, silent. But what if it's not just irony? What if it's also literal truth? What if the groom were there and the wine really were for him, but the groom's identity were exactly what John chose not to reveal explicitly? Some ancient textual traditions, preserved in patristic commentaries and manuscript variants, suggest that the first readers of the Gospel of John knew something we don't. No, that there was a shared context, implicit information that made the omission of the groom's name not a narrative flaw, but a deliberate literary choice, like when someone tells a story and omits an obvious detail because everyone already knows. "So we went to that restaurant," and you don't need to say which one because your listener already knows which one you're talking about. John wrote for a specific community, and it's possible that for that community, the identity of the groom of Cana was common knowledge, something that didn't need to be said explicitly. But then came institutionalization, the councils, doctrinal standardization, and suddenly that common knowledge became inconvenient. Now I want to know from you, after everything we've examined so far, Mary's behavior, the gaps in the text, the details in the original Greek, what are you thinking? Can you see what John might have been trying to communicate in a veiled way? Write in the comments your honest reflection. Don't be afraid to say "I don't know" or "I'm confused." This journey is about asking questions, not about having all the answers. Your perspective matters. And I want to build this investigation together with you. When we talk about apocryphal gospels, we need to clarify something important. We're not talking about fake or invented books. Apocryphal means hidden or secret in Greek. These texts are real historical documents, written in the first centuries of Christianity, that simply weren't included in the official canon of the Bible. Why? The reasons vary. Some were considered theologically problematic. Others were used by groups that the institutional church considered heretical. And some were simply forgotten, copied less frequently, until they disappeared. But some survived. And when we examine them, we find alternative traditions about Jesus that are fascinating. Let's start with the Gospel of Philip, discovered in 1945 in Nag Hammadi, Egypt. It's a 3rd century Gnostic text, but studies suggest it preserves much older oral traditions. In a specific passage, the text speaks of 3 women who always walked with Jesus: Mary, his mother, her sister, and Magdalene, the one who was called his companion. The word used here, koinonos in Greek, is significant. It can be translated as companion, partner, or consort. It's a word that implies intimacy and deep partnership, not just casual friendship. The text continues, describing that Jesus frequently kissed Mary Magdalene, and the disciples were uncomfortable with this, asking why he loved her more than them. Now, Gnostic traditions are complex and symbolic. Many scholars argue that these descriptions are metaphorical, representing spiritual union, not physical, and that's a valid interpretation. But there's another possibility. What if they're both? What if the Gnostics used real human relationships as symbols of greater spiritual truths? After all, that's exactly what John does in his canonical gospel. He uses real historical events, a wedding, a storm, a fishing trip, as vehicles for deep theological truths, history and symbolism intertwined. Another interesting text is the Gospel of Mary, Magdalene, also found in Nag Hammadi. Here Mary appears as a prominent disciple, someone who had special teachings from Jesus that the other apostles didn't have. Peter, in the text, becomes jealous and questions why Jesus would have revealed things to Mary that he didn't reveal to the men. Levi, presumably Matthew, defends Mary, saying, "If the Savior considered her worthy, who are you to reject her?" These texts show us something important. In the first decades of Christianity, there were intense debates about the role of women, about Mary Magdalene specifically, and about the nature of her relationship with Jesus. And these debates weren't abstract. They were personal, loaded with emotion, as if there were living memories, orally transmitted traditions that conflicted with the narrative being institutionally established. Now it's crucial to emphasize, apocryphal Gospels don't have the same historical authority as the canonical Gospels. They were written later, often by communities with specific theologies. We can't simply accept everything they say as historical fact, but we also can't completely ignore them because they preserve traditions. Memories of communities that knew people who knew the apostles. They're like echoes of ancient conversations. And when multiple apocryphal texts, written in different places by different groups, all mention a special relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, that deserves attention, not as definitive proof but as evidence that this was a widely known tradition in the early centuries, a tradition that eventually needed to be suppressed. Why? Well, if Jesus had a companion and intimate partner, that raises complex theological questions about his humanity, about celibacy, about the role of women in church leadership, questions that the councils of the 4th and 5th centuries preferred not to face. So Mary Magdalene was reinterpreted, transformed from prominent disciple into repentant sinner, a convenient narrative that diminished her, that made her dependent on Jesus' mercy instead of a partner in his mission. Pope Gregory the Great in the year 591 made this reinterpretation official in a sermon, identifying Mary Magdalene with the anonymous sinner of Luke 7 and with Mary of Bethany. 3 different women merged into one and defined primarily by her sinful past. Modern biblical scholars recognize that this merger was a historical error, but the damage was done. For 1400 years, Mary Magdalene was known as a prostitute, not as the apostle to the apostles, a title that early church fathers like Hippolytus of Rome gave her. Only in 2016 did the Vatican officially elevate Mary Magdalene's celebration to feast status, recognizing her apostolic role. But even so, the popular image remains distorted. Returning to the apocryphal Gospels, there's a particularly intriguing text called Pistis Sophia, Faith Wisdom, a 3rd century Gnostic dialogue. In it, Mary Magdalene is Jesus' main interlocutor, asking more questions and receiving more teachings than any other disciple. At one point, Jesus says, "Mary, you blessed one, whom I will perfect in all the mysteries of the heights." And the male disciples complain that Mary talks too much, that she dominates the conversation. Peter specifically expresses irritation with her. This conflict between Peter and Mary appears in multiple apocryphal texts. And it's significant because Peter represents institutional authority. He's the rock upon which Jesus said he would build his church. Mary represents something different: direct knowledge, personal intimacy, mystical revelation, 2 types of authority in tension, and historically we know which one prevailed. But let's return to the wedding at Cana. Is there any apocryphal text that speaks specifically about this event? Not directly. But there are intriguing references in patristic writings, texts of the early church fathers. Origen of Alexandria in the 3rd century mentions in a commentary that some interpreted the wedding at Cana as Jesus' own wedding, but he quickly dismisses this idea as absurd. What's interesting is that he felt the need to dismiss it, which means the interpretation existed. It was known enough that Origen needed to refute it. Tertullian, another ancient father, also makes vague references to carnal interpretations of the wedding at Cana that needed to be corrected. Why did so many early Christian theologians worry about refuting an interpretation that supposedly never existed? The answer may be simple: because the interpretation existed, and it was widely disseminated. Perhaps it was even the original interpretation, transmitted orally by those who knew John. But as Christianity became institutionalized, as clerical celibacy became doctrine, this interpretation became inconvenient, so it was silenced. Not by violent destruction of texts, although that also happened in some cases, but by something more subtle, simply ceasing to copy, ceasing to comment, ceasing to teach, until after generations the memory was lost, but lost memories are sometimes recovered. And when we find fragments of them in ancient texts, in oral traditions preserved in marginal communities, in linguistic analyses of canonical gospels, a pattern emerges. A pattern suggesting that early Christians knew something about Jesus that later generations chose to forget. To fully understand the wedding at Cana, we need to understand how Jewish weddings worked in the first century. Because when we place the event in its appropriate cultural context, the strange details begin to make sense. Jewish weddings of that time were long and elaborate processes. They began with the betrothal, erusin in Hebrew, which was legally binding. The couple was considered legally married, although they didn't yet live together. This betrothal period could last a year or more. During this time, the groom prepared a home to receive his bride. Usually he built an additional room in his father's house, a tradition Jesus mentions in John 14:2. "In my Father's house are many rooms. I go to prepare a place for you." When everything was ready, the wedding ceremony itself happened, nisuin, and this ceremony was followed by a feast that lasted 7 days. Not a few hours, 7 complete days of celebration. The groom was responsible for everything: food, drink, entertainment, accommodation for guests who came from far away. It was a massive demonstration of hospitality and prosperity. And wine was especially important. Studies of ancient Mediterranean culture show that wine wasn't just a beverage, it was a symbol of joy, prosperity, and divine blessing. Abundance of wine meant God's blessing upon the marriage. Running out of wine before the end of the feast was therefore a disaster on multiple layers. It was a failure in hospitality, a grave offense in Mediterranean culture. It was a sign of poor management, suggesting the groom didn't have the capacity to provide for his family, and it was seen as a bad omen, as if God weren't blessing that union. The shame would be public and lasting. That wedding would be remembered forever as the one where the wine ran out. Now, who was responsible for preventing this? The groom and his immediate family, especially the groom's mother, who traditionally supervised the preparations and the running of the feast. Which brings us back to Mary. Mary acts exactly as a groom's mother would act. She monitors supplies. When she identifies the problem, she acts immediately to protect the family's honor. She doesn't consult the master of the banquet, doesn't look for the groom, she goes straight to the solution. And the solution is Jesus. Why would Jesus be the natural person to solve a wine crisis at a wedding, unless it were his wedding? There's another important cultural detail. At first-century Jewish weddings, the groom had a specific role during the feast. He was the supreme host. He circulated among the guests, ensuring everyone was being well served. He was the face of hospitality. And where is the groom during the wine crisis in Cana? Silent, invisible. But Jesus acts. And when the master of the banquet tastes the miraculous wine, he goes to the groom and praises him for having saved the best wine until now. The groom doesn't correct him, accepts the praise in silence. Would this be mere coincidence? Or would it be because the groom and Jesus were the same person? Bible scholars intensely debate this possibility. Most reject it, arguing that if Jesus were the groom, John would have said so explicitly. But others point out that John frequently uses irony and narrative concealment, saying truths in a veiled way for those with ears to hear. There's biblical precedent for this. Jesus himself taught through parables specifically to hide truths from those who weren't ready to understand them. To you it has been given to know the mysteries of the kingdom of God, but to others it is told in parables. Luke 8:10. What if John were doing the same, telling the story in a way that those inside the community would understand, but leaving enough ambiguity to protect sensitive information? There were practical reasons for this. The Gospel of John was probably written between 90–100 AD. At this time, Christians were beginning to face more intense Roman persecution. Christian documents could be confiscated and used as evidence against the community. If the Gospel contained information that could be used to delegitimize Jesus, like marriage, which some in Roman culture might interpret as diluting his divinity, that could be dangerous. So John may have chosen to tell the story in coded form. For those who knew the details were sufficient, Mary acting as the groom's mother, Jesus solving the wine crisis, the nameless groom who accepts credit for the miracle. For outsiders, it was just a nice story about a miracle at a wedding. But there was another reason, perhaps more important for the ambiguity: rabbinic tradition. Jewish rabbis often taught through unanswered questions. They left intentional gaps in their narratives to force the listener to think, to investigate, to seek deeper layers of meaning. It's possible that John, writing for an audience with a Jewish mindset, was using the same technique. The gaps aren't flaws, they're invitations. Invitations to look more closely, to ask uncomfortable questions, to not passively accept the superficial interpretation. And when we ask those questions, when we examine the cultural details, when we place the event in its appropriate historical context, a possibility emerges. A possibility that the institutional church preferred not to explore. If the wedding at Cana was indeed Jesus' wedding, the next obvious question is, with whom? The canonical Gospels don't give an explicit answer, but when we examine the pattern of female presence in Jesus' life, one name appears consistently: Mary Magdalene. Who was Mary Magdalene? The Gospels describe her as one of Jesus' most devoted followers. Luke 8:2 mentions that she was one of the women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases, specifically that 7 demons had gone out of her. This description was later interpreted as evidence of demonic possession or sexual sin, but linguistic analyses suggest something different. In Jewish literature of the time, 7 demons was frequently code for completeness of affliction. Not necessarily literal possession, but deep suffering of any kind. It could be physical illness, psychological trauma, or social oppression. What we know for certain is that after this episode of healing or liberation, Mary Magdalene became part of Jesus' inner circle. And here's the crucial detail. She's mentioned by name more times in the Gospels than most of the male apostles. She appears in all 4 Gospels. And in all 4, she's present at the most important moments: the crucifixion, the burial, and the resurrection. In fact, Mary Magdalene is the first witness to the resurrection. In John 20, Jesus appears first to her, not to Peter, not to John, to Mary, and he calls her by name, Mary, and she responds, Rabboni, my master, my teacher. There's an undeniable intimacy in this scene. The resurrected Jesus, in his first moment of human appearance, chooses to appear to Mary, in a garden, alone, at dawn. It's a scene loaded with symbolism. Garden like Eden, dawn as new beginning, Mary as the new Eve, witnessing the birth of a new creation. But it's also a scene of deeply human intimacy. He says her name in a specific way. She recognizes his voice immediately, and her first reaction is to try to touch him, a gesture suggesting prior physical familiarity. Jesus says, "Do not hold on to me," in the original Greek, miaptu, which literally means don't hold me or don't cling to me, suggesting she tried to embrace him, hold him, perhaps the way you hold someone you love and whom you thought you'd lost forever. Scholars debate the theological meaning of this phrase, but the human meaning is clear. There was a relationship there, a relationship marked by affection, trust, and intimacy. Now, let's connect the dots. Mary Magdalene is described as one of the women who served Jesus and the disciples with their own resources. Luke 8:3. The Greek word used is diakoneo, to serve, minister, provide. It suggests she had financial resources and used them to support the ministry. Where would this wealth come from? Some traditions suggest she was from a wealthy family in Magdala. Others speculate she had her own source of income. But there's another possibility rarely considered. She could be using shared family resources, as a wife would. In first-century Jewish culture, unmarried women rarely traveled with groups of men. It would be scandalous, but wives could accompany their husbands, especially on religious pilgrimages or teaching missions. And here's something fascinating. The Gospels mention that Jesus and his disciples were frequently invited into people's homes. But when they arrive, who receives them? Often women. Martha and Mary in Bethany, Mary, mother of John Mark, in Jerusalem, and Mary Magdalene is constantly present in these domestic scenes, not as a servant, but as co-host. There's an intriguing passage in Luke 10:38-42. Jesus enters a village, and a woman named Martha receives him in her home. Her sister Mary sits at Jesus' feet, listening to his teachings. Martha complains that Mary isn't helping with the domestic work. Many scholars identify this Mary as Mary of Bethany, not Mary Magdalene, but ancient patristic traditions sometimes merge them, suggesting perhaps they were the same person, or that there was intentional confusion in the oral transmission to protect identities. What's interesting is Mary's behavior. Sitting at a rabbi's feet was the classic position of a disciple. But more than that, it was a position of intimacy, permitted only to close family members or formally accepted students. And Jesus defends her. When Martha complains, Jesus says, "Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her." The better part, agathen merida in Greek. It can mean the best portion, as in an inheritance, or the best role. Mary chose the role of disciple, of learner, of intellectual and spiritual partner. And Jesus publicly validates this choice. In a culture where women were rarely taught Torah, this was revolutionary. But it was more than revolutionary. It was personal. Because teaching your wife, sharing sacred knowledge with her, elevating her as an intellectual and spiritual partner, this wasn't just accepted in Jewish culture. It was expected. It was part of the marriage ideal between devout people. The Talmud, compiled centuries later but reflecting ancient traditions, speaks about the importance of a man teaching his wife. "Whoever teaches his daughter Torah is as if he taught her frivolity," said some conservative rabbis. But others, more liberal, argued that teaching one's wife was a sacred obligation. Jesus clearly belonged to the second category, and if Mary Magdalene was his most dedicated student, his first witness to the resurrection, his constant companion in ministry, supporting him financially and remaining at his side until death and beyond, what does this tell us? For some, it doesn't say anything definitive. All this could be explained as deep discipleship devotion, without romantic or marital implications. But for others, the pattern is undeniable. And when combined with the evidence from the wedding at Cana, with traditions preserved in apocryphal texts, with the historical necessity of the institutional church to redefine Mary Magdalene as a sinner instead of a partner, a coherent picture emerges. A picture of a woman who was wife, disciple, witness, and apostle, and who had to be systematically erased from history to protect a narrative of celibacy that served the institutional interests of the medieval church. To understand why the possibility of Jesus being married is so controversial, we need to understand how the doctrine of celibacy developed in the church. Here's the surprising fact. In the first centuries of Christianity, clerical celibacy wasn't mandatory. In fact, it wasn't even common. Peter himself, considered the first pope, was married. We know this because the Gospels mention his mother-in-law, Matthew 8:14. Paul in 1 Corinthians 9:5 refers to the right of apostles to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles, and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas, Cephas being another name for Peter. So in the early years of the church, it was perfectly normal for Christian leaders to be married. When did this change? And why? The change was gradual, happening over several centuries. But the main factors were theological, practical, and political. Theologically, there was a growing influence of Greek philosophy, particularly Platonism, which saw the physical body as inferior to the spiritual. This perspective wasn't originally Jewish. Judaism celebrates physical creation, including sexuality within marriage, as good and blessed by God. But as Christianity spread through the Greco-Roman world, it absorbed local philosophical concepts. The idea that virginity was purer than marriage began to gain traction. Paul contributed to this, though in a nuanced way. In 1 Corinthians 7, he writes that it would be good for all to remain single like him, but recognizes that each has his own gift from God, and that it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Paul wasn't condemning marriage. He was saying that given the circumstances of persecution and the expectation of Christ's imminent return, it might be more practical to remain single. It was contextual advice, not a universal commandment, but later generations interpreted these words as elevating celibacy above marriage. Practical factors also influenced. As the church became more institutionalized, the question of inheritance arose. Married bishops might try to pass their positions to their children, creating ecclesiastical dynasties. Church property could be fragmented through family inheritances. Mandatory celibacy solved these problems. It ensured that clergy loyalty was exclusively to the institution, not to family, and it kept ecclesiastical properties and resources intact. It was at the Council of Elvira, around the year 306, that we see the first formal legislation requiring clergy to abstain from conjugal relations. But even this wasn't universally accepted or practiced. Mandatory celibacy only became official law in the Roman Catholic Church at the Second Lateran Council in 1139, more than 1,000 years after Jesus. But here's the issue. If the Church was building a doctrine of mandatory clerical celibacy, basing it on the supposed superior purity of virginity, then the possibility that Jesus himself had been married would be problematic. Not impossible to reconcile theologically. After all, Jesus was fully human and fully divine, and his humanity would include normal human experiences. But it would be inconvenient for the narrative being constructed. It would be simpler, cleaner, if Jesus were presented as perpetually celibate, a model for the celibate priests of the medieval church. And so, over the centuries, any tradition suggesting Jesus' marriage was silenced. Not by explicit official decree, there's no council that says Jesus definitely wasn't married, but by omission, by avoiding the subject, by reinterpreting ambiguous passages in ways that excluded the possibility. The wedding at Cana became just a story about a miracle. Mary Magdalene became a repentant prostitute, and Jesus' complete humanity, including the possibility of intimate relationships, romantic partnership, experiencing human love in its totality, was gently erased. This doesn't mean there was malicious conspiracy. Most ecclesiastical leaders throughout history acted with sincerity, doing what they believed was best to protect the faith. But sincerity isn't the same as historical accuracy. And now, 2,000 years later, we're in a position to ask questions our ancestors couldn't ask. We have access to ancient manuscripts discovered only in the last century. We have tools of linguistic and historical analysis that didn't exist before. We have academic freedom to explore possibilities without fear of heresy. And when we use these tools, when we ask these questions, when we look at the evidence with fresh eyes, a different image of Jesus emerges. Not less divine, not less holy, but perhaps more completely human. Before we continue, I need to know something. Where are you watching this video from? Write in the comments your city, your country, because this search for truth is happening globally. On every continent, in every language, people are asking the same questions, questioning the same narratives, and I want to see how far this wave of awakening has reached. So right there, where are you watching me from right at this moment? The first centuries of Christianity were marked by extraordinary diversity. There were dozens of gospels circulating, multiple interpretations of who Jesus was and what his teachings meant. Christian communities in different regions practiced the faith in radically different ways. This diversity wasn't chaos. It was richness. It reflected the complexity of human experience with the divine. But as Christianity grew and became institutionalized, especially after it became the official religion of the Roman Empire, under Constantine in 313 AD, there was growing pressure for uniformity, theological uniformity, liturgical uniformity, narrative uniformity, and it was in the ecumenical councils, large gatherings of bishops to decide doctrinal questions, that this uniformity was forged. The most famous is the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. Convened by Constantine, it brought together about 300 bishops from across the empire to resolve controversies about the nature of Christ, particularly the debate between Arius and Athanasius about whether Jesus was created or eternal. What emerged was the Nicene Creed, a formal statement of faith defining Christian orthodoxy. Anything outside this creed was heresy, but what's not often discussed is the process by which this creed was reached. It wasn't direct divine revelation. It was human debate, political bargaining, theological compromise. Constantine personally presided over parts of the council, and he had clear political interests. He wanted a unified religion that could unify his empire. Theological diversity meant potential division, so there was institutional pressure toward uniformity, and part of this uniformization involved deciding which texts were inspired scripture and which weren't. The New Testament canon as we know it today wasn't formally finalized until the Council of Carthage in 397 AD. Before that, different Christian communities used different collections of texts. Some included the Gospel of Thomas, others used the Shepherd of Hermas. The Apocalypse of Peter was widely read, and there were many others, Gospels, Acts of Apostles, epistles, that were considered useful, inspiring, or true by various communities. What the councils did was create an official list, 27 books in the New Testament, nothing more. But what were the criteria? Officially accepted texts needed to 1. Have apostolic authorship or close connection to the apostles, 2. Be widely used in the churches, and 3. Be theologically consistent with Orthodox faith. The third criterion is the problematic one. Because Orthodox faith had already been defined by the same bishops who were now choosing which texts supported that faith, it was circular reasoning. Texts that presented Jesus in ways that didn't fit emerging orthodoxy were excluded, not necessarily because they were false or invented, but because they were inconvenient, Gnostic gospels that emphasized direct mystical knowledge over institutional authority. Excluded, texts that presented Mary Magdalene as a prominent leader, marginalized, narratives that suggested Jesus had deep human relationships, including possibly marriage, silenced. And here's the crucial point. The councils didn't just decide what would be canonical, they also influenced how canonical texts would be interpreted. Take the wedding at Cana. John's text was accepted in the canon, but the interpretation that it could be Jesus' own wedding was discouraged, not by careful textual analysis, but because it didn't fit the theological narrative being constructed. Similarly, Mary Magdalene's role in the canonical Gospels was reinterpreted. She was there in the text, impossible to remove, but her importance was diminished through sermons, commentaries, and oral tradition controlled by the ecclesiastical hierarchy. It's important to understand, we're not talking about conspiracy in the modern sense. There weren't secret meetings where bishops maliciously decided to suppress truth. It was more subtle. It was the natural process of institutionalization. As any movement becomes an institution, it inevitably sacrifices some complexity and diversity in favor of cohesion and control. Christianity isn't unique in this. It happens with every religion, every social movement, every philosophy that becomes established. But understanding this process frees us to ask questions that were discouraged for centuries. It allows us to return to the original texts with fresh eyes, without the filters of institutional interpretation accumulated over time. Because here's the liberating truth. You don't need the institution's permission to read the Bible and ask your own questions. You don't need to accept interpretations that were established by political councils 1700 years ago. True faith doesn't fear questioning. It invites it. And when we return to the Gospels without institutional filters, when we examine the wedding at Cana with attention to cultural and linguistic details, when we consider traditions that were marginalized but never completely destroyed, a richer, more human, more complete narrative emerges. A narrative where Jesus isn't less divine for being completely human, where experiencing romantic love, marital partnership, physical intimacy doesn't diminish his holiness, but completes it. Because if God became human, then the complete human experience, including marriage, isn't tainted by divinity. It's sanctified by it. The councils chose a different narrative, a safer narrative, more controllable, more useful for the power structure they were building. But suppressed narratives have a way of resurfacing. Buried truths are eventually unearthed. And perhaps this is the moment. Perhaps 2,000 years later, we're ready to see Jesus not through the lenses of 4th century ecclesiastical politics, but as his contemporaries saw him, a radical Jewish rabbi, a profound teacher, a powerful healer, a challenger of corrupt religious authorities, and possibly a man who loved and was loved, who experienced the sacred partnership of marriage, who understood the totality of human experience because he lived it fully. This isn't a truth that diminishes Jesus. It's a truth that makes him closer, more real, more capable of understanding our own struggles with love, relationships, commitment, and loss. And if the wedding at Cana was indeed his own wedding, then that first miracle gains profound meaning. It wasn't just about transforming water into wine. It was about transforming a moment of potential shame into celebration, about providing abundance where there was scarcity, about protecting his family's honor and his beloved's. It was Jesus being fully human and fully divine at the same time, and perhaps that's what the councils decided to hide, not because it was false, but because it was too true, too human, too intimate, because a Jesus who loved deeply, who committed to a partner, who experienced marital joy and possibly the pain of loss, that Jesus can't be easily controlled by institutions, that Jesus belongs to the people, not to the bishops, and perhaps that's why this truth was silenced. So what changes if Jesus was married? What does this mean for your faith, your understanding of the divine, your personal relationship with the sacred? For some, it might seem this diminishes Jesus, makes him less transcendent, less divine, more common. But consider the opposite. What if this makes him more divine? One of the central mysteries of Christianity is the incarnation, the idea that God became human, not partially human, not pretending to be human, but truly, completely human. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, writes John in the prologue to his Gospel. Flesh, not spirit disguised as flesh, not divinity wearing a temporary human costume. Real flesh, with all its limitations, needs, and experiences. If this is true, if Jesus was truly human, then he experienced everything that's part of the complete human experience. Hunger, thirst, fatigue, physical pain, but also joy, friendship, laughter, and love. Love in all its forms. Brotherly love, compassionate love for the marginalized, filial love for his mother, and possibly romantic love for a partner. Why would this last type of love be excluded from his human experience? Wouldn't the exclusion of this dimension make his humanity incomplete? There's deep theology here. If God chose to experience humanity and chose to do so through all its dimensions, including possibly marriage, then this doesn't profane divinity. It sanctifies humanity. It means your relationships, your commitments, your love for your spouse or partner, this isn't separate from the sacred. It's a form of participating in the divine. Paul writes in Ephesians 5 that marriage is a profound mystery that reflects the relationship between Christ and the church. But what if this metaphor worked in both directions? What if the reason marriage can reflect the Christ-church relationship is because Christ himself experienced marriage? This isn't new theology. Medieval mystics often wrote about union with Christ in romantic and even erotic terms. Saint Teresa of Avila described her mystical experiences using language of physical intimacy. Saint John of the Cross wrote passionate love poetry about the soul-seeking union with the divine beloved. They understood something profound. Human love in its highest form is a portal to the divine, not a distraction from it, not something to be transcended, but a path to experiencing the sacred. And if Jesus experienced this kind of love, if he had a partner with whom he shared life, mission, intimacy, and commitment, then this validates your own search for meaningful love. It means when you love deeply, you're participating in something Christ himself experienced. You're not being worldly or carnal. You're being fully human in the way God intended. There are also implications for how we understand spiritual authority. If Mary Magdalene was Jesus' partner, companion in his ministry, first witness to the resurrection, then she wasn't just a passive follower. She was a leader in her own right. And the fact that her leadership was systematically diminished over the centuries tells us something important about how religious institutions treat women, not because the Bible requires this diminishment, but because patriarchal power structures require it. Rediscovering Mary Magdalene's true role isn't just historical correction, it's spiritual liberation. For women who were taught their only option is to support men instead of lead. For men who were taught that true partnership with women is impossible in spiritual contexts. The truth about the wedding at Cana, if it really is true that it was Jesus' wedding, breaks these oppressive patterns. And finally, there's an implication for how you understand your own spirituality. You don't need to choose between humanity and divinity, between earthly love and heavenly love, between body and spirit. Jesus didn't make that choice. He lived both, completely, simultaneously. And you can too. Your search for meaningful relationship isn't a distraction from your spiritual search. It's part of it. Your experience of romantic love isn't inferior to mystical love. It's a form of mystical love. All of this is validated if Jesus was married, if he experienced what you experience, if he knew the joy of partnership and perhaps the pain of loss, if he understands when you pray about your own relationships because he had his own. This doesn't diminish Christ. It makes him more accessible, more empathetic, more capable of being a high priest who can sympathize with our weaknesses, Hebrews 4:15, because he was tempted and lived in all things as we are, including love. You might be wondering, all this is historically fascinating, but why does it matter now? Why 2,000 years later should we care whether Jesus was married or not? The answer is because truth always matters, especially truths that were suppressed to serve institutional agendas. We're living in a moment of global awakening. People around the world are questioning narratives that were accepted without examination for generations. They're demanding transparency from institutions that historically operated in secrecy. They're reclaiming authority over their own spiritual lives, and this awakening includes asking honest questions about religion, not to destroy faith, but to purify it, to separate it from control structures that were built around it. The question of Jesus' marriage is emblematic of a larger problem, the tendency of religious institutions to shape historical narratives to serve their present needs. When the medieval church needed to justify mandatory celibacy, it created a narrative where Jesus was perpetually celibate. When it needed to diminish female leadership, it transformed Mary Magdalene into a repentant prostitute. When it needed to consolidate power, it excluded texts that emphasized direct mystical experience over institutional authority. Understanding these historical processes frees us to make conscious choices about our own faith. We don't need to accept pre-packaged bundles of beliefs. We can examine evidence, ask questions, reach our own conclusions. And this isn't heresy, it's spiritual maturity. Jesus himself encouraged questioning. When John the Baptist in prison sent disciples to ask, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect another?" Jesus didn't condemn the doubt. He responded with evidence. The blind see, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised. Matthew 11:5. He treated the honest question with respect, offering reasons to believe instead of demanding blind faith. And we should do the same. When someone asks, "Was Jesus married?" the honest answer isn't, "Don't ask that," or "Accept what the church teaches." It's, "Let's examine the evidence together and each come to our own conclusion." There's also practical implication for contemporary lives. Millions of people struggle to reconcile spirituality with sexuality. They were taught that body and spirit are opposites, that physical love is inferior to spiritual love, that marriage is a concession to human weakness, not a celebration of human strength. These ideas have caused incalculable harm: shame around sexuality, guilt in relationships, inability to integrate different dimensions of human being. But if Jesus experienced romantic love and marital partnership, this changes everything. It means these experiences aren't obstacles to holiness. They're paths to it. Young adults who are leaving churches in droves, surveys show this is happening globally, often cite the inability of institutional religion to speak meaningfully about relationships, sexuality, and identity. They feel they have to choose between authenticity and spirituality, between their bodies and their souls, between living fully and following God. But this isn't a choice Jesus would require, because he didn't make that choice. He lived fully, spiritually, physically, emotionally, relationally. Rediscovering Jesus' complete humanity, including possibly marriage, offers a path to integration. For young people who no longer need to choose, for people in relationships who no longer need to feel they're being less spiritual, for everyone seeking full life, not divided life. There's also an implication for how we understand sacred texts. The Bible isn't a magical book that fell from heaven complete and unaltered. It's a collection of human writings, inspired, profound, transformative, but written by people in specific contexts, compiled by councils with specific agendas, translated by scholars with specific assumptions. Understanding this doesn't destroy scriptural authority, it matures it. It teaches us to read with discernment, to ask questions about context, to recognize layers of interpretation added over centuries, and it frees us to find deeper truth. Not truth imposed from above by institutional authorities, but truth discovered through honest investigation, sincere prayer, and authentic community. The wedding at Cana in this light becomes more than just a story about a miracle. It becomes an invitation to look more closely, to ask uncomfortable questions, to not accept superficial explanations when details don't make sense. And when we do this, when we have the courage to question, we discover that faith doesn't crumble. It deepens, because true faith isn't blind agreement with established doctrines. It's trust that truth, wherever it leads, is better than comfortable illusion. And the truth about Jesus, whether he was married or not, is that he lived fully, loved deeply, challenged authorities courageously, and invites us to do the same. This matters today because you matter. Your questions matter. Your search for truth matters. Your need for integration between body and spirit matters. And you don't need anyone's permission to search. You don't need to wait for religious institutions to change their official narratives. You can read the texts yourself, ask your own questions, come to your own conclusions, and live your faith with integrity, not with blind obedience, because that's what Jesus did. And if he invites us to follow him, then that includes following his example of courageous questioning, authentic love, and full life. That's what matters, today and always. We've reached the end of this journey, but actually it's not the end, it's the beginning, because what you discovered here isn't a complete package of definitive answers. It's an invitation to continue searching, continue questioning, continue allowing your faith to evolve and mature. The wedding at Cana remains in many ways a mystery. We don't have definitive historical documents that prove, beyond shadow of doubt, that it was Jesus' wedding. We probably never will. But we have questions, legitimate questions based on careful textual analysis, cultural and historical context, and traditions preserved in multiple ancient sources. And these questions teach us something important. Mystery isn't a flaw. It's an invitation. God doesn't demand you have all the answers. He demands you be honest in the search, that you don't accept comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths, that you trust the sacred is big enough for your doubts. Jesus said, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." John 8:32. He didn't say blindly accept what religious authorities say. He said, know the truth. And knowing requires searching, investigating, questioning, not with cynicism, but with sincerity. Not to destroy, but to discover. If Jesus was married, if the wedding at Cana was his own marital celebration, if Mary Magdalene was his companion and partner, if he experienced the totality of human love, then he understands you more completely than you imagined. He understands your struggles in relationships, your joys in partnership, your pains in loss, because he lived it too. And if he wasn't married, if he chose celibacy, then he understands the cost of that choice, the renunciation, the loneliness, the sacrifice. Either way, he understands, because he was completely human. That's the central message, not the definitive answer about a specific historical event, but the deeper truth about who God is and how God relates to us, through complete humanity, through shared experience, through love that doesn't fear intimacy. You don't need to be afraid of your questions. You don't need to be ashamed of your doubts. You don't need to accept narratives that don't resonate with your experience of truth, because you were created in God's image, and that includes your capacity to think, question, and search. Use that capacity. Seek truth wherever it leads. Trust that God is big enough for your honest doubts, and live fully, as Jesus lived, without dividing your being into acceptable and unacceptable pieces, without hiding parts of yourself that seem too human to be spiritual. Because if there's anything the wedding at Cana teaches us, whether interpreted as a common event or as veiled revelation, it's that the divine doesn't avoid the human. It embraces it, celebrates it, transforms it, water into wine, common into extraordinary, human into divine. And you're invited to this celebration, now, today, always. If this journey moved you, if it awakened questions you didn't know you had, if it made you see the Gospels with completely new eyes, then you need to stay connected. Subscribe to this channel now, because we'll continue exploring truths that were forgotten, narratives that were suppressed, mysteries that were buried. And here's the most important thing. You're not alone in this search. We're thousands, no millions, around the world, asking the same questions, seeking the same truths, refusing to accept superficial answers. So subscribe, turn on notifications so you don't miss any revelation, and click on the next video that will appear on your screen, because this investigation is just beginning, and what you're going to discover next will deepen everything we explored today even further. Don't let this search die here. Continue. Question, seek, discover. Truth is waiting for you. Thank you for watching to the end. Until the next video.